the county I lived in Washington State, where I grew up, they adopted ranked choice voting back, 15 or 20 years ago. And they used it for an election cycle and immediately repealed it. Because, it's just a mess. And it doesn't make things better. It just makes things more complicated. Why would we want that?
Keeping our republic is on the line, and it requires patriots with great passion, dedication, and eternal vigilance to preserve our freedoms. Jenny Beth Martin is the co-founder of Tea Party Patriots. She's an author, a filmmaker, and one of Time Magazine's most influential people in the world. But the title she is most proud of is mom to her boy-girl twins. She has been at the forefront, fighting to protect America's core principles for more than a decade. Welcome to the Jenny Beth Show.
Today I'm joined by Trent England, who is the Executive Director of Save Our States. We're going to be talking about ranked choice voting and the importance of the Electoral College. Trent, thanks so much for joining me today.
Absolutely, Jenny Beth. Thank you for having me on the program.
So tell everyone a little bit about your organization and what it does, and then we'll get into the issues.
Yeah, so I created Save Our States back in 2009 to defend the Electoral College. It's something I've been interested in since I was in college, way back in the 1990s, before it was cool, right? I mean, that's before Bush v. Gore. It wasn't really a topic of conversation. But I got fascinated in how the American founders created this and how they developed its use in the first couple decades of our republic. And so when I saw that the left had launched this campaign called National Popular Vote, I wanted to make sure that there was somebody pushing back and educating people. And so that's where Save Our States started. From there, we have grown to engage not only around the Electoral College, but also around something called ranked choice voting, which is another very, bad idea like this National Popular Vote campaign, trying to change our elections in fundamental ways that I think really would undermine our republic. So those are the big two issues that we work on at Save Our States.
Okay, and why is the Electoral College so important?
Yeah, I mean, the Electoral College is important for several different reasons. The one that many people latch onto, and this is right and good, is that it gives people in smaller states, in rural areas, small towns, a little bit more of a voice than they would have otherwise. I think people can think about the Electoral College as checks and balances because it puts an upper limit, that would be the check, on how much power any one state, really any of the big states, can have. They have a lot of power. California has the most electoral votes because it has the most people, but it only has that much power, right? Once you win all of California's electoral votes, that's all you get. And so by putting a check on that power, it creates a balance. It pushes the power out to other states and makes sure everybody has a voice. That's a really good thing all by itself. But it also does a couple of other things. It uses state borders, sort of like the watertight compartments on an ocean liner, so that if you have a problem in presidential elections, it's contained in an individual state. We remember, I mentioned Bush v. Gore from 2000. Mm-hmm. In that election, the issue was contained in Florida, right? It was a big deal. There were still state and federal lawsuits, but at least it was contained in one place. Without that, you would have an election problem anywhere affecting the whole country, right? And you wind up sinking the Titanic that way. We don't want to do that. And, as kind of a corollary, it keeps the states in charge of elections, right? And so because we have the Electoral College, states are in charge, and it protects federalism, this unique system of states that we have in that way. And I think for all those reasons, it's just really important and very foundational to our constitutional system.
Okay, I think I understand why you said that it would sink the Titanic if it were the national popular vote instead of being contained to a state. But elaborate on that and make sure that everyone understands. And I'm not telling what I think, just elaborate, and then if I have more questions, I'll ask.
Yeah, sure thing. So, when I grew up, at least, the proverbial case of, people being concerned about elections would be the Chicago cemeteries that supposedly voted at very high rates. If a Chicago cemetery is voting in a presidential election, all that can happen is it affects Illinois' electoral votes. Now, that's bad. If there's election fraud in Illinois, that's a bad thing. But at least it's contained in Illinois. With national popular vote, it would affect the whole country. And that, I think people will agree, is much, much worse. So that's where we have this system that contains, and as with Florida, right, it can just be something as simple as an administrative problem, poorly run elections. Anything like that is at least limited, the effects are limited to individual states. Because
in Florida, in 2000, in the Bush v. Gore case, every county had to be consistent, like the laws within the state, it had to apply to everywhere, right? But if it messed up and with a national popular vote, there could be a problem in Jackson, Mississippi, and then the whole country could wind up having to deal with that problem, right?
Well, that's right. And actually, you raise another point that I'm glad a lot of people don't pick up on this, right? Which is the issue in Florida was this patchwork of counties doing different things. And what the courts ended up saying was, you can't do that, right? I mean, and this violates a constitutional protection called equal protection. But I think for most people, I mean, it just violates kind of the common sense of the way elections should be run, right? If everybody's voting in a district for a county commissioner, all the votes in that county should be treated the same way. If we're voting in a statewide race for governor or to choose our state's presidential electors, all those voters need to be treated the same way. And some of those counties in Florida were trying to do things that might benefit one side or the other, probably because some of the counties leaned one way and some leaned the other way. And that's just politics, but we have laws so that kind of politics doesn't spoil our elections. And the problem with this national popular vote proposal that's out there is that it would try to combine votes from all the different states, despite the fact that all the different states have different laws, and you wind up with something like that Florida situation nationwide. So, I mean, you could have a really serious election problem if we tried to just throw all the votes together across state lines.
Okay, and then when the founders decided on the Electoral College, they did this based on the number of each state has the number of electors or the number of senators and the number of representatives, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And why is that important?
Well, to be honest, the reason it was important for the founders was that they had already hashed that out, and that was really hard to do. I mean, people who are familiar with that history will know the whole Constitutional Convention almost collapsed,
right?
Because they were having a hard time figuring out how to balance state interests, population interests, big states, small states. They came to that compromise, created the House and the Senate, and then when it got to the end of the Constitutional Convention, and they were trying to figure out, I mean, they debated this on and off through the whole summer, how to elect a president. I mean, at first they were trying to figure out, are we going to have one president or are we going to have like a council of presidents or something, right? I mean, they really were starting with the basics. But when they hammered out the Electoral College, they said, let's just use that congressional math. And so it's modeled on Congress, right? Every state has the same amount of power that it has in Congress with the House and the Senate. And that creates those checks and balances, right? It gives every state a voice, but the bigger states get more, but the littlest states get a little bit of a boost.
Right, and it equalizes. So each state is equal in the Senate.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the House is based on population. And when I run into people who are like, oh, we need to get rid of the Electoral College, it's just antiquated or whatever, I'm like, we wouldn't have a country if we hadn't made that compromise in the very beginning, and it protects the small states now. It would make it where nobody would even pay attention to the small states. They would only be going to the biggest populations for campaigning.
That's right. I mean, instead of having the United States of America, we would kind of have the United Media Markets of America, right? The biggest media markets would get the attention. And it's anybody who's been involved in political campaigning at at least a statewide level, at some kind of higher level, will know you have limited resources. You have to look at where are the people, where are they accessible. I mean, I remember looking at precinct maps and you've got this area where people live down long driveways with big dogs, and you've got this area where people live in a subdivision right next to each other. Where do you go? Right? You go to the subdivision, even if there's the same amount of population in both of those areas. you'd be crazy to go face the big dogs, right? You go where people are packed together. And the Electoral College doesn't completely solve that problem, right? I mean, you still have a harder time having access to the levers of power if you live in rural America. That's just a reality. But the Electoral College at least recognizes that and tries to help out.
Right. Well, and if you were working for me and we wanted to go to those more rural areas, it'd be a two-person team.
That's
So
right.
one's driving and one's hopping in and out of the car.
Yeah.
I've done some of that. But it's really important. I remember right after the election last year, I was on the plane with somebody, and he thought he knew everything about our elections. He is a citizen. He was originally from Canada, and he was complaining about the Electoral College. And I said, but you don't actually understand the United States history. You don't understand how we got how the Constitution even passed. We had to. The Electoral College, the number is based on the Senate and the House, and all of this was a huge compromise in order to create Congress so that we could create a government for our country. And I finally just said, you need to go read more about the Constitution and how it started, because when they say things like that, I'm like, you don't understand. This is part of the glue that has held our country together for nearly 250 years.
That's right. And a fun fact about Canada is that not only do they not elect their prime minister in a direct national popular vote, right? They have a parliamentary system, but because of that, and their parliamentary system, right, members of parliament are elected from particular areas, can work out just like our Electoral College. They have had 2 elections recently where the Liberal Party won more seats in Parliament than the Conservatives, even though the Conservatives got more popular votes, because the Conservatives tend to be clustered together in the Rocky Mountain region, in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, whereas the Liberals are more spread out. And so, it's always ironic when you hear those criticisms from Canadians, because their system turns out to work the same way.
That is very ironic. Okay, so you're working on this, and why do you have to focus on the Electoral College? Why is it something you're even spending energy and time on?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I hear a lot. People say, look, it's in the Constitution. They can't change it. Yes and no, because the problem is that not every bad idea is unconstitutional. And what the left came up with, particularly a man named John Koza after the 2000 election, John Koza was an Al Gore elector in California. He also has the notoriety of having invented the scratch-off lottery system and patented that and made a good deal of money doing that. And so he's very wealthy, very left-leaning computer scientist, basically, came up with this idea. What if you had states manipulate the Electoral College to force it to rubber stamp the national popular vote result? And to his credit, he looked at the Constitution, and the Constitution gives state legislators the power to figure out how to represent their state in the Electoral College. And, today, every state holds an election. But that's not because of the Constitution. That's because of these state laws. So John Koza says, what if we just change those state laws? And the states say, we will choose our presidential electors based on the nationwide popular vote. So in 2000, you would have states say, well, it doesn't matter how people voted in our own state. If the nationwide popular vote went for Al Gore, then we give all of our electoral votes to Al Gore. And if enough states do this, Al Gore can't lose, even though the Electoral College remains in place. I mean, this, an idea can be terrible and dangerous, even evil, and still be very clever, right? And potentially be constitutional. Now, I do think there are reasons why this should be considered unconstitutional, but I would never put all my faith in federal judges, even with our even with our courts being better. That we don't want to do that, right? We want to stop this in state legislatures. 17 states have passed this. Basically, all of the blue states have passed this national popular vote legislation. But it only takes effect. It has a trigger. It only takes effect if they get enough states that they would control 270 plus electoral votes, they would control a majority, and that's the election outcome. So even though they have states worth 209 electoral votes that have passed this law, obviously they need another 61 electoral votes worth of states to put it into effect. So we're working as hard as we can against that, but it's a real threat. And again, maybe courts should strike it down. I think courts should strike it down if it ever attempts to take effect. I mean, you can't sue at this point because it hasn't taken effect.
Okay.
So that a lawsuit wouldn't be ripe. But we want to stop it before that, and we really want to educate Americans so that Americans, and especially state legislators, when they look at an idea like this, will just understand why it's a bad idea, right? That's what we really want.
And do smaller states, smaller blue states, even think this is a good idea?
So,
or have they learned that that's actually harming their power?
Well, here's the tragedy, I think. When I started this in 2009, and I went to states like Vermont and Delaware and Connecticut and Rhode Island and Maine, you did find a lot of Democrats who said, this is bad for our state. It violates this constitutional principle of checks and balances. And even if we as Democrats, are frustrated by, at that point, it was just the 2000 election, we're not going to do this. Since then, in all of those states, the Democratic Party has moved so far to the left that the number of Democrats who are willing to take that position has really dwindled. And, sometimes you'll even hear things like, hey, I'm against it. I understand this isn't a good idea, but if it goes to the floor, I have to vote for it because basically the progressive funders and the progressive activists on the left are so anti-Electoral College, so anti-Constitution, that people are scared they're going to lose their primaries if they stand up for the Electoral College.
Wow. So what can people do on this portion?
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about ranked choice voting, but what can they do to help?
Yeah. So what's really important is to know where your state stands on this. And if you're in a red state, your state has not passed it. If you're in a blue state, your state probably has passed it. If you're in a purple state, that depends. We have a big fight going on right now in Nevada, where the Nevada legislature is considering this. We have a big fight in Maine, where even though the legislature passed it last year, things have gotten a little bit better there in November, and so we may be able to repeal it in Maine. And so if folks are in one of those states, reaching out to your legislators, letting them know what you think is just critically important. But even in other states, states can get out of it if they're in it. We've found that in some of these states that passed this maybe back in 2008, 2009, there are very few, if any, legislators who are around then. So bringing this to their attention, asking them to reconsider is certainly worthwhile. And then just educating the people in your life about this system, the genius of the Electoral College. We made a documentary a few years ago called Safeguard, an Electoral College story, and people can find it on streaming services. They can find it at our website, saveourstates.com. But Safeguard tells this story. Why do we have an Electoral College? Why is it important? What might change if we got rid of it? And frankly, we try to do it in a very nonpartisan way, right? We remind people, lots of Democrats have won the Electoral College. I mean, every person who's won the presidency has done it because they won the Electoral College. Barack Obama put together a coalition that was able to win the Electoral College. And so Safeguard, I think, is a really good resource for people who want to dig into this more.
Okay. Now, you also work on trying to prevent ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
Ranked choice voting, that sounds kind of like a good thing. Why is it bad?
Yeah, ranked choice voting on its surface, it's sold as this system that gives voters more choices. You don't have to just pick one candidate. You can express your opinions about a whole bunch of candidates, 4 or 5, or in some systems it might be a dozen that you're asked to rank on your ballot. And it's also sold as, maybe the candidates will be nicer because even if they're not your top choice, they'll at least want to be your second or third choice. And so we'll get just a better kind of politics. I mean, all things that I think most of us would, I'm not against voters having good choices. I'm not against candidates being respectful to each other. Those are good things. The problem with ranked choice voting is it doesn't lead to those results. And it has all of these other negative side effects that basically boil down to it makes voting harder for voters. It makes election administration a lot harder for the people who run our elections, and it makes election results a lot harder to trust. And I think, when you're making elections harder all the way through, and then not delivering on your promises, that's just not a good way to run elections.
No, it's really not. And you and I have talked about this before. One of the things that it does is it makes your ballot much bigger.
Yeah.
And more complicated. So you don't just figure out who the person is you want. You've got to know who the person is you want, plus the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and then also game it so well, I really want that person to be the winner, so I might need to vote for these other people before I vote for that. It's very complicated then with voting.
And it's, the people who push it oftentimes will say, I've been to conventions where they're advocating ranked choice voting, and they'll say, it's like ranking your favorite ice creams or ranking your favorite kinds of vacations. I was at one conference and they had this, do you like the beach or the mountains or the cities or whatever? And I thought, how misleading is that? Because, I'm really involved in politics, but when I go to vote on my ballot, I know who I want to vote for, but I don't know. There are lots of candidates I don't know anything about because I'm not planning on voting for them, right? I'm voting for somebody else. The idea that, we all know chocolate ice cream and vanilla ice cream and strawberry ice cream, right? Everybody knows what those things mean.
But if you had to vote for all the other
That's right.
39 flavors or whatever.
Yeah. I don't necessarily know, John Smith running for dog catcher on the, Green Party platform, right? I don't know who he is. I don't need to know who he is under our system now. But with ranked choice voting, you need to know who everybody is.
Right.
And, is this person my third choice or my fourth choice or my fifth choice? I think some of the people who push ranked choice voting really honestly they're political junkies. They're people who, they tend to be young people, the kind of stereotypical young, college-educated activist who just wants to make politics better. And they forget that there are a lot of Americans out there who find it a challenge to vote to begin with. And, I think those of us who've been involved in political campaigns and voter turnout understand this. A lot of our fellow Americans, they are daunted by the process, right? They're intimidated. And the idea that we're going to have a bunch of college kids and elites making the process harder for all of these ordinary people, I just think is, we've got to stop it. That is not the direction that we want our elections to go in, turning off more people from voting.
Well, think about using the ice cream analogy that you were just using. You might know, I want vanilla before I want chocolate, before I want strawberry. But if you have to go and rank almond and pistachio and butter pecan and walnut, they're all nuts. You don't you don't care. It's one or the other, and you don't really have a preference for it. And to figure out, well, I don't even, they all just sort of are.
Well, and I think it's a little worse than that, right? I'm a conservative, and so if there are several conservatives running for an office, to me, they might be like different flavors of ice cream, right? I like this one better, but the other ones, they're sweet enough, right?
It might be chocolate cake and cheesecake that you're voting on instead, because they're not even ice cream anymore.
If there's somebody on the ballot who's a Marxist, to me, that's more like, comparing ice cream and dirt. Dirt is not my fourth choice. Right. It's not my choice. I'm not going to eat dirt.
Ever.
Right?
I'm never voting for it in any capacity whatsoever.
Exactly.
Don't force me to vote for
3 kinds of
Marxist.
ice cream and 3 kinds of dirt, right? That's a nonsensical situation to put voters in.
And if you're actually liberal, you're never going to want to vote for a conservative either. It goes both ways.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And And look, the reason why we've seen ranked choice voting pushed in some places is just pure politics. Because in Maine, the Democrats, they wanted ranked choice voting because they were having this problem in Maine. I mentioned when we were talking about the Electoral College that a lot of those Democratic parties had become much more extreme. Well, in Maine, they kept having a problem with having splinter candidates in statewide races, and that's how Maine elected a Republican governor and reelected a Republican governor a few years ago. And the Democrats looked at that and said, well, if we switch to ranked choice voting, we don't really have to hold our coalition together. We'll just let people blow off steam by giving their first place vote to some splinter candidate. But as long as they give their second place vote to the Democrat, then we'll start winning elections again. And that's exactly what happened in Maine. The Democrats flipped the governor's office, flipped a congressional district up there, just for, they wanted ranked choice voting just because changing the rules meant that they would change the outcomes of elections, which, people can debate, again, whether this is a good or bad idea. But I think it's important to recognize that some of this is just pure partisanship.
Well, and that is not how it should be done.
Yeah.
The election should be, we all have our partisan pick, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian or a constitutional party, whatever it may be, we all have our number one pick for that. But I think that we should be able to also agree that the election should be a fair playing field for all parties. And when you get away from that and you're playing favorites with the rules, that just seems wrong.
Well, and when you're changing the rules for short-term partisan gains, I think that's just, everybody should step back from that and say, wait a second. Yeah, I mean, we should be looking at what's good for voters, what's good for the system. And, when it comes to elections, I think, you really have a heavy burden of proof if you're asking Americans to move away from the basic, normal electoral process that we have always used, right? You pick a candidate, you vote for that candidate. Maybe there's a runoff or something like that. Some states do that, but you don't have this complicated worksheet kind of ballot. And frankly, I think Americans, as they have this debate in some in some states, Americans seem to be on our side on that, because a number of states last November voted down ballot measures that were pushing ranked choice voting. There were a whole slew of ballot measures in a bunch of states, and they all failed except for Washington, D.C. That was the only place that adopted ranked choice voting in November. Everything else went down to defeat. And I think it's because our side got much savvier about helping voters just walk through the process. And when people understand, oh, that's what ranked choice voting is, then they tend to oppose it. So it's been good to see that, and to see, I think, just a lot of Americans, standing up for basic, normal, common sense elections.
And where have you been successful in stopping ranked choice voting? Where have you not been? Where do you need help in the coming months?
Yeah, so we have seen, I think I have a map here, and we've seen a whole slew of states that have banned ranked choice voting, and this has been one of the most exciting things I've ever worked on in politics, because it's always hard to push state legislation, right? Especially on a multi-state basis. And you go back 5 years ago, there were no states that had bans on ranked choice voting. Some state laws made it easy to do. Some state laws made it hard or maybe impossible to do, but nothing actually banned it. A few years ago, we had we had two states. It was Florida and Tennessee first. They banned ranked choice voting 3 years ago. Then we added 3 more states the next year, then 6 states last year. So in 3 years, we've gone from 0 to 11 states that have banned ranked choice voting. Yeah, it's amazing. And right now, in states around the country, places as diverse as Ohio, Wyoming, North Dakota, there is legislation to ban ranked choice voting, all those places. There's legislation to get rid of it in Maine. I think that's going to be hard with the Maine Senate, at least this year. But we're seeing a real pushback against it. And yeah, I mean, kind of like with national popular vote, find out where your state is. We've got a map that we update every week at stoprcv.com where people can find out, has my state banned it already? Is it being used in some cities in my state? We see that in a lot of places. And people can engage. They can talk to their legislators. I mean, here again, for some reason at Save Our States, we get involved in these sort of complicated issues, right? But it's fun because you win by educating people, right?
Right.
Like you just win by helping people understand what's really going on. And then, some people may wind up on the other side, but the average American says, no, wait a second. I want to protect the Constitution. I want to protect normal elections. I want to keep power in the states. I want checks and balances, right? I want a simple ballot. And so we're really excited to be able to partner with Tea Party Patriots and just so many of our friends around the country to just educate Americans, right? That's how we win.
Right. Now, what about Alaska? Are you going to be able to get it repealed there after the attempt and the slim
that
loss?
Was heartbreaking last
Yes.
year. Lost by, I think it was 740 some votes, after it was ahead on election night.
And weeks of counting.
Yeah. I mean, Alaska, they need to do a variety of things to improve their elections in Alaska. There is another repeal effort, which is great to see. I mean, the folks up there have just picked themselves up, dusted themselves off, and they're going at it and just, they were outspent by a huge margin up there. And I think as they make the case, I do think that they're going to have a good shot at getting repeal. But it's tough. There's been so much money on the other side. We've heard a rumor that at least one of the major funders of ranked choice voting may be pulling out because they suffered such massive losses. Yeah.
Good.
So that's exciting to hear. That would be a huge victory. So maybe the playing field really is going to shift in our direction and we'll get rid of it in Alaska.
That would be really good. Alaska's a tough state because in the winter, it's really hard to get around to a lot of the state. So
even in the summer.
So I understand that it makes getting the ballots back in and counting. They have. I've been to Alaska only once. I got to see the Northern Lights. It was gorgeous, beautiful. Highly recommend it to everybody. But it also helped me to appreciate the terrain and how much different it is. So I cut them a little bit of slack when it takes longer to get the ballots in and count them. But man, they need to get rid of ranked choice voting.
Yeah, no, that's right. Ranked choice voting creates a particular problem for Alaska because to count ballots in statewide races in particular, all the ballots, or at least all the ballot data, has to be centralized. You can't start going through the multiple rounds of ranked choice tabulation until all of the data, every single ballot, has been fed into the system. And so, that guarantees that their election results are going to be even slower than they'd be otherwise. Because in a lot of races, if once the margin gets beyond the number of outstanding ballots, you can call the election, even if you're still going to get some ballots and count those ballots and have an accurate total. That should always happen, but you still can know who won. With ranked choice voting, that burden, or the threshold, right, gets a lot more difficult to achieve. And so in a lot of these elections, it may look like somebody's leading, but once you start doing those RCV rounds, right, it can flip things in weird ways. So it takes Alaska's problems and makes them even worse. Yeah,
it exacerbates them. So in Georgia, the Secretary of State has called for instant runoffs.
Yeah, which is really another name for ranked choice voting. And the problem that some of our southern states have, like Georgia, is that at some point as the federal law changed to try to better protect military voters, and you've got military voters and then other overseas voters who get lumped in with them, most states just expanded their election calendar. They added weeks between primaries and general elections and runoffs. Some of the southern states basically started using a version of ranked choice voting for overseas voters so that if you were going to need a runoff, you in theory could do this instant runoff on the ballot. That's wound up being a camel's nose under the tent. Those states really just need to do what other states have done and expand their election calendar And frankly, I think in Georgia with the runoffs, really having a 50% threshold, in my opinion, doesn't make sense. If someone, the way they do it in some places is if you are, if you're ahead by a certain amount, even if you're under 50%, you win the election. Maybe you have to have at least 45% of the vote and be ahead by at least 1% or something. There are ways to have a threshold in there where, it's just kind of silly if you have a candidate who has 49.8% of the vote to then say, oh, but we have to have a runoff election that's expensive and time consuming and creates this instant runoff desire that we see in some of these states. So yeah, that's an issue when it comes to ranked choice voting.
Well, I think it would probably be, I don't know if it's better to get rid of the runoff or not, but they can address the problem in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of states just don't have runoffs, and I think I did a focus group in Georgia, and it was funny. Some of the Georgia voters were surprised, and as soon as they found that out, they said, "Why don't we just get rid of it?"
Yeah, I think that you could get rid of it. I think there's, because I grew up in Georgia, something to be said for knowing that the person who represents you has the majority of the voters behind them. Yeah. There's something affirming in that representation, but at the same time, I know that under normal circumstances, that runoff, under normal circumstances, the people who vote in the runoff are not nearly as many people.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue. If you have some kind of a threshold or something, I think that that makes more sense. And every state has its own way of doing elections. I really encourage people who are interested in election policies, especially state legislators, to look at how other states do it.
Yeah.
Because I met with a lot of legislators who just really don't know how it works in other states. And once they learn that, it at least opens your eyes that there are a lot of different options, right? And maybe you can find some ways to make things better in your state just by adopting, a few things from other places.
Without totally blowing up the way that elections are run by doing instant runoff or ranked choice voting.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, how much better to use something that's worked well somewhere else than to adopt something that
is
really
only being used in one or two states completely and is a huge mess.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing about ranked choice voting historically is that it seems new in the United States only because almost everywhere that's used it in the past has gotten rid of it.
Oh.
It was pushed in the U.S. starting in the early progressive era, so like back to the 19-teens, 1920s, and a bunch of states, or a bunch of cities, about 40 cities, started using ranked choice voting, including some major cities, and they all got rid of it. I mean, it's wild. Actually, the county I lived in Washington State, where I grew up, they adopted ranked choice voting back, 15 or 20 years ago, and they used it for an election cycle and immediately repealed it because it's just a mess, and it doesn't make things better. It just makes things more complicated. Why would we want that?
Right. Okay. Before we end, what do you think of open primaries where? Or maybe that's the wrong word, but where there are not open primaries, but nonpartisan, everything, like California, where you can still be partisan, but everyone's on the ballot, all jungle primary. Yeah. That's the word.
Well, no, it is tough because even you go to the academic literature about all of this and nobody's sure quite what to call these systems, because traditionally a primary election was how a political party chose the candidates that would go to the general election. And now we have the California system where they call it a top two primary, but it's not really about that. So as I've said, I grew up in Washington State. Washington and California are the two places that have this top two kind of jungle primary system. I think it's a disaster. Yeah. Because what we've seen in California, I mean, here again, it gets pushed as, we're going to have more moderate candidates. We're going to have less, vitriolic and obnoxious campaigns. I mean, I always tell people,
it's human beings involved. There's going to be vitriol no matter what.
That's right. And California uses this, right? If you think California is a well-run moderate state, then go for it with top two elections, right? Nobody thinks that. Democrats don't think that. People forget that Kamala Harris won her Senate race running statewide in California against another Democrat. Republicans had no one to vote for in that election. Think of the disenfranchisement that you have in an election system like that, where you have a significant portion, millions of Californians are Republicans, and they can't even put a candidate on the ballot. So, no, that's the top two California style system, I think, is a disaster. There's a group in Oklahoma where I live that says they're going to put this on the ballot there. So people should be on the lookout for this. Now that they've taken such a beating on ranked choice voting, we may see them pushing this California system in other places. And we've got to be alert to that. It is not a good way to run elections.
Yeah, I heard, I don't know, I haven't followed this very closely, but I think that there may have been a state legislator in Georgia who said, let's make our state legislature nonpartisan elections. And someone said, hey, what do you think about that? Like on a signal group or something I was in. I said, I think you'd wind up with a California system if you did that, where everyone would be on the ballot and then you'd have a runoff, and it'd be like what Louisiana just got rid of and what California has. And they were like, oh, don't California my elections.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what they said.
That's right. Nebraska has a system that's kind of like, Nebraska has a very strange unicameral, supposedly nonpartisan state legislature. When I've been up there, I have not been impressed with how it operates. I mean, the reality is all the insiders know what party people are members of. It just means that the general public has less information.
Yeah, you're just hiding it from the general. It's a way that I don't even know why it was introduced. So if I'm right about this, and it was introduced by a Republican, why a Republican would have wanted to introduce it. But I just think all of these, whether you're getting rid of the Electoral College or you're changing ranked choice voting or you have a jungle primary or any of these things, you're just complicating a system that by and large has worked for our country for most of the time that we've been in existence. And now you're just trying to tweak it so much that it takes it away from what has worked.
Well, and I think it's even a little bit worse than that, because the problems that many of these reformers are trying to solve are problems that were caused by the previous generation of reformers doing the exact same thing. A lot of what we see today, to the extent, as you say, human nature. Politics in the American founders' day was nasty. Yes. And there was all kinds of backbiting and
hit pieces and media pieces.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's nothing new.
But one of the problems that we do have today is that the political parties, the campaign finance regulations that were passed back, at this point, over 20 years ago, about 25 years ago, they crippled the political parties, especially our state political parties. And so today, a lot of people look at state political parties, Democrats and Republicans, right? And they say, our parties are pathetic, right? They don't raise money consistently. They don't care about their brands. They're not serious. They're not seriously run. And so, we've got to do away with political parties, right? Political parties are bad because I look at my parties and I'm not happy with how they work. Well, when I first got into politics in the 90s, political parties were much healthier because they could just raise and spend money like normal political organizations. Now that's all been pushed out to third-party groups, super PACs, 527s, all of that world. And ultimately, we live in a free society, right? You have to be able to spend money in politics. That is the core of what it means in the First Amendment, freedom of speech in the press. By the way, when the founders wrote that, the press was partisan. And so, freedom of speech and the press really kind of meant political groups. But we're not going to solve the problems created by campaign finance reform by more of that tinkering that you described, right? I just wish these reformers would take a step back, try to figure out what actually caused these problems, and let's go undo some of these unnecessary regulations that they passed 25 years ago.
Well, I think you're doing amazing work Now,
you.
how can people get involved? What are the websites so they can be involved with your work?
Yeah, so on the Electoral College, it is saveourstates.com. That's where folks can find the film Safeguard and just lots of information about what's going on in the states with this National Popular Vote campaign and what we're doing to stop it. On ranked choice voting, stoprcv.com is our nationwide coalition where we're working to stop RCV. So that's pretty simple. But we're on X, we're on Facebook. We're not on Blue Sky, but no, we love for people to connect with us on social media. And the guy who runs it, if you've got questions, you can DM him and he'll answer your questions. We love to help and network with Patriots out there.
Well, thank you so much, Trent. Thanks for all the work you're doing to help save our states, to prevent ranked choice voting, and to ensure that we actually have representative democracy in America.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny Beth. It's great to be here. It's a fun conversation.
The Jenny Beth Show is hosted by Jenny Beth Martin, produced by Kevin Mooneyhan, and directed by Luke Livingston. The Jenny Beth Show is a production of Tea Party Patriots Action. For more information, visit teapartypatriots.org.
If you like this episode, let me know by hitting the like button or leaving a comment or a 5-star review. And if you want to be the first to know every time we drop a new episode, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for whichever platform you're listening on. If you do these simple things, it will help the podcast grow, and I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much.